Everyone, welcome back. Today we're looking at Apple. The US sues Apple for illegal monopoly over smartphones. This is very interesting. This is perhaps one of the biggest news of the year, especially in the tech, stocks and shares space, and the finance space. This is going to be huge news. For the last few years, Apple has been in quite a few different disputes, from Spotify to Netflix. And don't forget, Epic Games, the creator of Fortnite, had a huge case with Apple that Apple is technically an illegal monopoly. They're charging too much on the App Store for taxes. And this is Apple's tax. Apple have their own fee that they charge at the App Store. It's like 30%. Now, 30% might not sound like a lot, but when you consider that some of these companies are taking in millions, if not billions of dollars, it gets a lot. If a company earns in revenue, just in income, 1 billion from the App Store, 300 million is going to Apple, 30%, no question about it. We all knew that it was just a simple matter of time before this was brought up, because Apple has been lucky so far not to be called a monopoly. But this will be taken very serious, even if there'll be no consequences out of this case. The simple fact is this might actually affect Apple's growth, because how are you going to grow without being a monopoly? The idea of growing a business as large as Apple has to involve in some way having an advantage over certain markets more than your competitors. And it's right to say that Apple has earned that, but in some areas it's really suspicious, especially with the difficulties between messages between Android phones and iOS phones. That's a whole nother controversy. But let's just get into this article. The US Department of Justice accuses Apple of operating an illegal monopoly in the smartphone market in an expansive new antitrust lawsuit that seeks to unpend many of the ways Apple locks down its phones. The DOJ, along with 16 states and district attorney generals, accuses Apple of driving up prices for consumers and developers at the expense of making users more reliant on its phones. The party alleged that Apple selectively impose contractual restrictions on developers and withhold critical ways of accessing the phone as a way to prevent competition from arising according to release. And this is what I mean. Apple has certain walls and barriers. They don't make it easy to transition to an Android phone. If anything, when Apple users are transitioning to an Android phone, it is not good news, especially if you live in the US where you use Messenger as a daily way of communication. I didn't always know about this, but I'm recently learning about this. Apparently, the Americans, they do not like the green bubble. They love the Apple blue bubbles, though. So that in itself is very, very interesting. It's like a nerdy way of racism. I don't know. You tell me. The DOJ wrote, and I quote, Apple exercises its monopoly power to extract more money from consumers, developers, content creators, artists, publishers, small businesses, and merchants. The government points to several different ways that Apple alleged illegally maintain its monopoly. Disrupting super apps that encompass many different programs and could degrade iOS stickiness by making it easier for iOS users to switch to competing device. That statement is a little bit weird if I'm being completely honest, because it's just a weird phrase, because it makes it sound like it's easy for iPhone users to switch to an Android. It's not, by the way. It's the other way around. So blocking cloud streaming apps from things like video games that would lower the need for more expensive hardware. Suppressing the quality of messaging between iPhone and competing platforms like Android. Yes, this is a very important point, because this barrier between Android and iPhones, it doesn't need to be there. But up until now, Apple has used this as a way to discourage Apple users from joining competing smartphone brands like Samsung, Huawei, just Android phones in general like Pixels. Limiting the functionalities of third-party smartwatches with its iPhone and making it hard for Apple Watch users to switch from the iPhone due to compatibility issues. Blocking third-party developers from creating competing digital wallets within tap-to-pay functionalities for iPhone. Now, this is important. This is where it gets interesting, because this is what Epic was suing Apple about. Apple has so many barriers. You're not allowed to go around their paywall. If you're Epic, if you're Snapchat, if you're any app on the iPhone, You're not allowed to create your own alternative payment system for your users to pay you. You have to use the one that Apple provides, and Apple will charge you 30%. So it seems like Apple has a lot of changes and shakeup that need to happen, and we knew this was an inevitability. We knew this would arise at some point. We just didn't know when, to be honest. With all those complaints, I remember Spotify has been complaining for years that Apple is not playing fair, especially with the people who provide apps to the App Store. 30%, that's a steep margin. Now, if Apple can justify this, I'm willing to listen. If you can justify, please make a statement, but they're not. Now, for you, it also says by the DOJ, and I quote, "For years, Apple responded to competitive threats by imposing a series of whack-a-wool contractual rules and restrictions that allow Apple to extract higher prices from consumers, impose higher fees on developers, true creators, and to throttle competitors' alternative from rival technologies." The case is being filed in the U.S. District Court for the District, New Jersey. In a statement, Apple spokesperson Fred Saint said that the lawsuit threatens who we are and the principles that set Apple products apart from fiercely competitive markets. If successful, it would hinder our ability to create the kind of technology people expect from Apple, where hardware, software, and services interact. It would also set a dangerous precedent, empowering governments to take a heavy hand in designing people's technology. We believe that this lawsuit is wrong on the facts and the law, and we will viciously defend against it. Yes. That's very interesting in itself because the statement is mentioned. Let me explain. Apple is really clever and really smart. They will use whatever they can to get the public's support. This is what the statement said, and I'll quote it again. I'll repeat. It would also set a dangerous precedent, empowering government to take a heavy hand in designing people's technology. First of all, that's always been the fact. That's not new. The government sets the rules. The lawmakers set the rule. So all technology that it's designed within the compliance of the governments. This is nothing new, but Apple puts this in there because it's like, hey, the government is threatening your free will, how we design technology for you. It's going to affect you. Apple wants you to have an emotional response. So you're not on the side of the government, you're on the side of Apple. Who am I on the side of? Who are you on the side of? Me personally, I'm on the side of the developers. Without the developers, the App Store would be damn useless. All those developers making their apps, and to give Apple 30%, and then to pay employees, and then to pay your own tax. So I think that Apple can actually be more generous to its creators, in my opinion. But the nasty part, in my opinion, is the fact that Apple won't allow you to offer your customers any alternative payment systems. Apple, in fact, says in a statement that you're not allowed to tell the consumer why they're being charged an extra 30%. Facebook tried to do this, and Facebook got reprimanded by Apple. Because Facebook tried to tell people, by the way, this extra 30% is not us. It's Apple who's charging this extra 30%. It's Apple's fault you have to pay this extra 30%. Apple did not like that. They reprimanded Facebook. Also remember when they got Fortnite removed from the App Store as well. This was in regards to a response by Epic that Apple did not like. I'm not going to get into that detail, of course, but you can see these statements. Apple is walking very carefully. They're choosing their words very wisely. And Apple is willing to play the game. Something tells me that they've been preparing for this lawsuit, for these complaints, for many years. They've been preparing for this because they knew they'd be called a monopoly at some point. They knew it. Google is being called a monopoly, and Google is now threatened very lightly. Many companies. This is why companies like Microsoft, they stay out of the spotlight. They stay out of the spotlight, yet Microsoft is the most valuable company in the world. Even more than Apple right now, I believe. They stay out of the spotlight. But Apple, on the other hand, you can't afford to stay out of the spotlight because the spotlight, that's what affords you your amazing customer base. It's a different kind of business. They both build computers, different kind of computers, different needs, different wants, different criterias, different value that you're offering people. Now, Apple is the second tech giant the DOJ has taken on in recent years after filing two separate antitrust suits against Google over the past two administrations. It reversed along a drought of tech monopolization case since the landmark Microsoft lawsuit at the turn of the century. Wow, so Microsoft has been there as well. They've all been there because after a while, you will be called upon as a monopoly when you have your hands in so many different pies and you have so many control over the market. Yes, you'll be called a monopoly eventually. Who's next? Companies like Google, Microsoft, and Apple, they take a very specific route. They create their own ecosystem. Even Microsoft does this, but they do it in such a smart way you hardly notice. Adobe could be said is kind of like a monopoly, but also maybe not. But also, Adobe is not, just hasn't got the spotlight on them yet. But the bigger you get, the more you create, the more hands, the more pies you gather. It's going to be tricky. App developers for Apple iOS have complained for years of the platform's closed and often opaque marketplace. Amongst most vocal have companies been like Spotify that run paid subscription services that Apple requires a 15 to 30% cut to be offered on the platform. On top of that, Apple has its own apps that compete with those on the App Store. True, Spotify, Apple Music. Fortnite, Apple has Apple Arcade, and they're developing that even more. They're bringing that to more spaces. They're making it more advanced. So it's going to get interesting because I've also heard news that Apple will soon have to allow for additional app store on their own devices. Because right now, the only app store that's available on an Apple device is the Apple App Store. However, on most Android devices, you can download additional app stores. It's more open source. In fact, that's always been the idea of Android. Apple has always been more closed off. They've never been anything else. Now, Europe has moved ahead of the US in efforts to rein in tech. It's instituted new rules through the Digital Market Act to place a check on the power of gatekeepers of large platforms, several of which operate by Apple. Earlier this month, the European Commission fined Apple 1.84 billion. I wonder, where does this fine go? All these billions that they're always fined in these companies, where does this money go? That's the question we should be asking. Now, this was in connection to a complaint from Spotify about its restrictive App Store practices. The EU said its investigation found that Apple bans music streaming service developers from fully informing iOS users about alternative and cheaper music subscriptions available outside the app. The DOJ will have its hands full with the monopoly suit in the coming years. It wraps up closing argument in its search distribution case against Google in May. And then it's set to begin trial in a case over Google's advertising technology in the fall. Wow, so they're not finished with Google. They're not finished with Google. But it's really complicated. All of these cases are really complicated. But if it yields good results for the creators, for the developers, I'm all for it. I'm always going to be on the side of the developers and the creators, despite the fact that I'm an investor and I want Apple to make more money, but we have to find different ways. Now's the time for Apple to change. Of course, they will try to avoid it as much as possible, but I think they know that change is inevitable. That's it for today's video. Thank you for watching, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Let me know what you think about this case. Peace.